So something that's come up more than a few times in the comments and emails that I get is, what position should the hands be in when we're climbing? Or what's the best position? Now, it's not that there's necessarily one best and optimal position for everybody. Of course, this isn't going to be the case. But there are some pros and cons and some characteristics of the different hand positions that might make them more useful to you in certain situations. Let's get out of the way, first of all, riding on the drops when we're climbing. Now, the drops are obviously the most aggressive position that we have. For most people, it's not going to be very sustainable because it does put, for the most part, most riders a little bit too aggressive in their torso position. And it's often just doesn't feel comfortable. We're moving into too much hip flexion, which puts some extra strain through the hips themselves. But aside from the drops, the hoods are probably the most versatile and most used climbing posture. It can be a really consistent posture for many riders for much or all of a climb, as long as your bike is fitted well and allows you to comfortably stay in this position, that is. The hand and forearm position is great when we're on the hoods as well, because it puts us into exactly neutral as far as pronation or supination goes. So we end up with a very relaxed forearm and hand position. It also, of course, places us near the brakes and the shifters so that quick stops or adjustments to cadence can be made depending on the pitch and terrain. Now, one thing about climbing is that it is a delicate balance with torso position and the bike. On the one hand, we have to tip our torso forward somewhat to account for the incline. Again, too much torso flexion leads to too much hip flexion on a consistent basis, which will put, again, too much strain through the hips and is just not comfortable for many people, as some will experience pain through the low back or something similar. Now, riding on the tops or on the flat sections of the handlebars is also very popular. This is the shortest posture as far as the reach goes, of course. And this is where it's a good time to introduce the idea that there is another cause for increasing our torso flexion on the bike. We do have it, of course, to account for the incline a little bit. However, as we ride and as muscles fatigue, there is going to be a natural inclination to rhythmically tip the torso forward. Now, why do we do this? Well, it's a bit more complex, but it comes down to how our muscles and their cross bridges work to generate force. As we stress a muscle, we either make it work harder or work for longer. It's going to seek out different portions of the muscle it can activate and can shorten in cross bridges in order to exert force through the pedals. And so when you see someone rhythmically leaning their torso forward as they climb, they are actually trying to rhythmically stretch the glutes or the hip extensors in order to eke out a bit more force. This is kind of best exemplified through this test. If I start with this skinny little person on the ground and resist them going into knee flexion, so I am stressing their hamstrings. The more force I pull on their hamstrings with, they are going to try and lengthen those hamstrings by getting the origin of the hamstrings, which is the sit bones, further from the knees. And to do this, they will tilt their pelvis forward and you'll see their hips rise up off of the floor. That's why this compensation happens when we do this test. Their hips are raising up to try and stretch the hamstrings further to eke out more force. Well, the same thing happens on the bike. As we fatigue or as we require more force through the pedal stroke to get up the climb, we'll lean forward in a rhythmic fashion usually to stretch those hip extensors and get different cross bridges firing, get them contracting and get more force from those muscles. So this is where the flats or the tops position can come in handy, because we can shorten our position such that it is still comfortable for our back and our hips, and yet we can rhythmically lean forward in order to stretch those hip extensors and get more force out of them. So we get a little bit of the best of both worlds. We get a comfortable and sustainable position, but one that we can modify kind of on the fly in order to get more force. Now, the big drawback to riding on the tops or on the flats is that it makes for a difficult transition to standing. Most people aren't going to feel stable standing with their hands in this posture, and they will instead switch from the tops to the hoods in order to stand up. So really the answer to this initial question is that it's generally going to be a combination of positions. And in fact, most riders will benefit from changing their hand position throughout a sustained climb, perhaps back and forth from the hoods to the tops and back again. Going back and forth between the tops and the hoods probably allows us the most variability on the active muscles and supporting tissues. In a future video, I'll show you how I use my hand positions and as well standing in order to improve endurance and climbing speed by kind of breaking the climb up into discrete sections and attacking it in certain ways. So I'll do that. I'm going to do that video shortly. In the comments, let me know what are your preferred hand positions? Why do you like those? I'm curious if anyone does use the drop position. I don't run into too many, but I'm sure there's a few out there. And that's all I have for this one. I will see you on the next video. Thanks, everyone.